Well, I really enjoyed that session. What were the key takings that you got out of it? Okay, wonderful. And did you have any particular feedback for me? Excellent. So make sure that you do your online practice prior to the next lesson, and have a lovely day, and I will see you next time. Thank you. Believe it or not, this was 3 years or 4 years before COVID, where this is how I used to work. So I actually taught English as a second language students online from all over the world. And this was at least 3 or 4 years before remote work or working online became the norm. It took an entire global pandemic to normalize something that has been a long time coming, given the internet is what dominates now our spaces and how we communicate and we do everything else. However, the COVID pandemic also really normalized the consultations and the sessions that we have with our healthcare providers that we have with our patients to also move into the digital space. Now, a lot of people think that when you're working with patients online versus when you're working in person, you're literally just transferring one set of skills from one space to the other. It's actually not true. It's a completely different set of skills. So in this video, I'm going to cover what are some ways in which you can be a much more impactful, empathetic, and influential communicator when working with your patients online during consultations as a healthcare provider. Back to my channel, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in and for your engagement, presence, and attention. So for those who don't know me, my name is Shweta. I'm the founder of Healthy Dynamics. We are a coaching practice that helps English as a second language speaking healthcare providers who would like to improve both their language fluency as well as their communication skills, become better communicators with more empathy, impact, and influence, build better relationships with their patients, and also stand out in their workplace as a person of excellence. So, like I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, remote work was only normalized after 2020, after the whole global pandemic came in and everyone was stuck at home and businesses had to still go on. And a person like me, I actually started teaching online at least 4 or 5 years before that happened. So I got a really good sense and understanding of how I had to make my presence online, how I had to build a rapport, how I had to build influence and authority online when I was teaching students in the online space. So most of my life, I have been a classroom teacher. So transitioning from there to doing it purely online, or at least 95% online during the global pandemic or even before that, was quite challenging for me personally. And I made the false assumption that, like I mentioned in the very beginning of the video, that speaking or teaching online is literally going to be like teaching, in a classroom, except I'm just moving things from one part to the other. I had a really rude awakening to realize that it was a completely different set of skills. Now, it becomes a little bit more tricky when you are a healthcare provider as well. Because remember, at the end of the day, you're not working with, like in my case, I was working with professional students. You are working with sick, injured, vulnerable people who don't have the information that's required for them to get to a better place, who are quite stressed and who are quite anxious and who are in a heightened state of all of the negative emotions. So in this situation, building a rapport, showing empathy, and building a presence and really connecting with your patients and collaborating with them can be much more challenging than what you would do in a face-to-face setting, because you don't have that advantage of a physical proximity like you did when you are doing face-to-face consultations. Now, we all know how online consultations, telehealth, how much that has revolutionized things for patients from that perspective. So how it has made their lives much easier, and how it has brought a lot of factors of convenience for them as well. And also really taking off the pressure and stress of actually going and sitting in a waiting room. And I remember when I had to do face-to-face consultations, that's why I dreaded it. I had to sit and wait for a long time till a provider came up and spoke to me as a patient. And that stress is completely now taken away once you have a telehealth or an online consultation. So what we have to do now as healthcare providers is sort of also up our game and be at the same level as our patients, to not only take this advantage of the convenience factor of it, and the fact that now you, if you're in a position to, can work with patients from or clients from all over the world. But the only thing is now that you have to not necessarily learn a new set of skills, but just double down and take, amplify some of your existing ones and also pivot on them on some of the skills that you have been using up until now in order to communicate better with your patients. Because at the end of the day, just because you are working online, it doesn't mean that your communication has to change, or it's just assumed that fundamentally it's not going to be as good as in person. So you have to keep it the same, if not better, in order to have your patients trust you and continue to work with you. So there are 4 key points that I wanted to cover on this one, so let's get straight into it. Number 1 is to ask many more open-ended, deep questions with your patients. Now, when you're in a situation like this, and when you're in a consultation face-to-face with the patients, it's quite inevitable for some awkward silences to come up. Maybe the patient is taking some time to process their thoughts together. Maybe you as a healthcare provider also need some time to absorb and digest what the patient has said. Now, that can just as well happen when you are doing an online consultation. The problem is when you have that little bit of an awkward silence that goes on for a very long time. Remember, online spaces, a short time can seem like eternity. That causes a lot of disengagement and disinterest from the patients. And that's why it's very important that you keep asking them deep-ended questions. Now, this is quite prevalent if you are a therapist. You have the advantage, but there is no reason why you can't do it even if you are a different sort of healthcare provider. I remember when I see my therapist, now even though she is literally 10 minutes from me, we do all our sessions online. And when she does do her time with me, she always asks very deep-ended questions, and if I'm not able to come up with an answer after a certain amount of time, she does sort of maintain that eye contact with me and sort of asks me some more deeper questions for how or on what to get more information of where I'm at. And that's something that you should really be incorporating, and that will just avoid and minimize those moments of awkward silence when you're in consultation with the patient, and so that the disengagement and disinterest really sort of drops down as much as possible. And the more you are showing that commitment that you're doing that, the patient will have more of a trust in you when you are trying to provide them that care and support that they really need. So that's number 1. Number 2, work on improving particular paraverbal cues and gestures. Now, this is going to be very different when you do a telehealth consultation versus a online consultation. And I have actually come up with a little cheat sheet. If you look at my LinkedIn post from the previous week, I have left a note that if people want to access that little cheat sheet on what signs and what parts of our body language and our tonality and hand movements, facial expressions and everything, which ones need to be done more in a telehealth consultation, so on the phone, versus the ones that have to be done online. So even though they are more or less the same, and they are sort of 80% similar, remember, in a telehealth consultation, you don't have the advantage of a screen, that you can't make eye contact. So you have to really lead with that when you're talking. When you're talking on the phone with a patient, you have to really lead with that, and that particular part of your paraverbal and nonverbal communication has to be top notch when you do that. I remember when I was working with patients in the radiology space, it was purely phone based, and it was like 10% online. So, and I had patients who were elderly. I had patients who didn't speak English as their first language. I had patients who had just, newly arrived into the country. So it was so diverse and it was so challenging. And when you don't have that, in-person interaction or in-person or even a virtual interaction when you can see their face and vice versa, it's very hard to pick up on what they're feeling, what their expressions are, what's going on in their mind, because you just have to roll with how your voice is. So you have to really watch out. I had to really watch out for things such as the pace in which I'm talking to my patients, the tone in which I'm using. I had to make sure that I'm not interrupting them or talking over them. And that took me a very, very long time to get right. I eventually did, and I'm not perfect by any means. So this is just an example of what areas I had to really amplify in order to communicate well with patients in in a telephone setting versus an online setting. So there are differences, but there are similarities. If you want to go and check out that particular LinkedIn post, and if you're interested in the guide, please comment down below, even in the video, and I'm happy to send that over your way. Moving on to the next point is regularly check in with your patient on how they are feeling. Now, you have this advantage if your telehealth or online session is a longer one. Like, for example, when I have sessions with my therapist, they're about 45 minutes. That's a long amount of time. And after we've done, an extreme unpacking of whatever it might be, whatever it is that we're covering, she'll ask me, what are you experiencing? How are you feeling right now? Is there anything that you'd like to share with me about how this experience was for you? So she checks in with me a lot of the time. And I find that really, really good, because I know that way that she's considerate of how I'm feeling. And based on that, she knows how intense or otherwise she needs to take the next part of the session. Now, when you don't have that advantage, when you don't have, say you have a 10-minute telehealth session, you obviously don't have that advantage. But it is important that at least 2 or 3 times you ask them how a patient feels about this, if there's anything else that you can do for them, if there is any other questions that they have. And this was particularly important. This is something that I had to do a lot of when I was on the phone with patients in my role in healthcare. So I had to, our interactions were about 5 minutes, so it was very quick. So I had to go through everything routine, but I had to still I had to ask the patients how they're feeling and how they, if they're okay with what was offered to them, and if they had any questions or if they had any feedback. That's very, very important. So that will really reaffirm the fact that you as a healthcare provider are committed to working in a way collaboratively with your patient and supporting them like a team member and looking out for their best interests. So that's very, very important. And finally, I cannot emphasize this enough, empathy, empathy, empathy. You have to absolutely take your empathy to the next level and completely amplify it to God knows everything, because it is so much easier, and it's so much easier to gauge as well when you're being empathetic and genuinely empathetic when you are in an in-person consultation. Whereas it's a very different ball game when you don't have the advantage of that physical proximity. So sometimes it's very hard to tell, okay, are you genuinely being considerate, or are you just doing this to tick a box? And that means that you have to ask, it sort of ties in very well with the 3 previous points that I made, how you can be more empathetic. And you can obviously go out and check out all of my past videos and content on LinkedIn on why empathy is important and all that. But that is going to be the number one thing, if not anything else. The number one thing you have to master is you have to become much, 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 much more empathetic when you are doing online or telehealth consultations. So these are some of the points that I covered on how you can, what skills you really need to amplify and get better at, and also shorten when you're trying to communicate with empathy, impact, and influence with your patients during online and telehealth consultations. If you want to check out similar content on everything else in the space of healthcare communication with patients, especially if you're as an English as a second language healthcare provider, make sure that you hit the subscribe button, the notification bell, and hit the like button if you genuinely found this video valuable and useful. And as always, thank you very much for your time, attention, presence, and support, and I will see you same time next week.